For each man that falls, 10 more shall take his place. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy and tactics focused 40k channel, where we're all about getting the most out of our miniatures on the tabletop. Today we're back for another Imperial Guard video, where today we're going to try and make one of the most competitive all-infantry Imperial Guard lists that we can. Now I've certainly had fun fielding huge hordes of guardsmen in various incarnations throughout 7th and 8th edition. Particularly in early 8th, Foot Guard was one of the strongest builds going around in the meta, and my trusty combination of Plasma Gun and Bolter Imperial Guard squads could generally be relied on to be more points efficient than virtually anything that they'd face. Sadly, those days are behind us, mainly due to the fact that everything else in 8th edition has got so much more lethal and durable, as each faction gained its own codex and new stratagems and options. That being said, I still think that Foot Guard could certainly ruin the day of some of the top lists in the meta at the moment. Hordes aren't quite as common as they once were, and people are usually opting to take more high-strength armor-piercing weapons to deal with the current Space Marine menace. So a truly enormous horde might just be able to shine through, swarm a lot of the table, steal a lot of objectives, and hopefully cause a lot of disruption, tying up tanks and bogging down elite infantry. Today we're going to look at one possible. Today we'll go through one of my takes on a competitive Foot Guard list, so let's have a chat about it. So I've chosen to go with Catachan for this list, and we'll be aiming here to pose almost as much threat in melee as we do in shooting through absolute bucket loads of strength 4 attacks. The list is organised into 3 Catachan battalions, meaning that we'll have a whopping 18 command points to play with, which will certainly be helping with morale, various rerolls, and other fun options throughout the game. The core and backbone of the list are 18 infantry squads, each armed with a plasma gun and bolter, that will be aiming to swarm the board's objectives. I still think that the plasma gun is the best choice for an infantry squad that we actually want to deal some damage, particularly in the current marine meta, where being able to one-shot intercessors wounding on 2s is pretty decent. The sergeant also has a bolter in each one of these squads, allowing them all to contribute to the weight of fire without giving up any melee potential. Now these infantry squads have an absolute ton of characters to support them as they move up the field. First and foremost we have Iron Hand Strachan himself, a reasonable melee threat for a guardsman, but more importantly handing out that absolutely beautiful +1 attacks. We also have 2 Ministorum priests that will also hand out a different attack, meaning that every single guardsman in the core of the army will be fighting with a brutal 3 attacks each at strength 4. Considering these guys are only 4 points, that is some hilariously efficient melee. Strachan can also provide 2 orders a turn, and will also give the Catachan officer leadership buff, meaning that most of the squads will be leadership 8, significantly helping us reduce casualties from morale. To this end as well, we have 3 company commanders, all with bolters, just to provide a little bit of extra cheap fire support, and I believe that we'd have enough points left over to give them all a power fist as well if we chose to provide a little bit more countercharge threat there. These chaps will advance with the main infantry battle line, making use of whichever orders are most usable in the situation, whether that's move, move, move to get right up in the enemy's grill, forwards for the Emperor to advance and still lay down some firepower, first rank, second rank, or when melee starts happening, we'll certainly be thinking about fixed bayonets to have all of those 2 or 3 attack guardsmen potentially fighting twice. Also in this general throng of guardsmen we'll have 3 astropaths, one being my personal favourite Psychic Maelstrom astropath, to throw some mortal wounds at whatever target we're most trying to focus, and the other 2 having Night Shroud and Psychic Barrier, so we can make one squad very hard to shift each turn, potentially the one that's furthest forward if we're in range, a squad on an objective, or perhaps if we start combining infantry squads, we could have a full 20 or more men that have 4+ armour and -1 to hit. We also have Commissar Yarrick around for further increased morale, and his very nice reroll ones which apply both in shooting and in melee, which when he's surrounded by quite this many guardsmen, will really start to add up in terms of extra hits. Just to add to the extra weight of numbers, we have a couple of special weapons squads, each with 2 grenade launchers and a plasma gun, just there to provide a few more bodies and a little bit more weight of fire. With just the infantry squads and special weapon squads alone, we're throwing 192 Imperial Guardsmen into the meat grinder. Unless the opponent's really tailoring towards anti-infantry firepower, that's going to take the vast majority of armies several turns to shift, and some elite armies just might not be able to grind through that many guardsmen the entire game long. Now to secure our backfield, we have some fire support units, again all with the standard guardsman defensive profile, meaning that the opponent really has nowhere efficient to point their anti-tank guns. First of all, we have a trio of veteran squads. These will be sat at the back with 3 sniper rifles in each, and a bolter and a las cannon. For a mere 72 points, these guys put out a decent amount of ranged firepower, as well as giving us a way to add some more bodies to the table. They'll be sat around with Gunnery Sergeant Harker, who'll be giving them all reroll 1s to hit, and blazing away with payback to contribute to the weight of fire. We also have 3 command squads, each deployed with a las cannon, to put in another few ballistic skill 3+ las cannon shots downrange. If there are any enemy tanks that are particularly proficient at killing infantry, things like Lehman Russ Punishers spring to mind, then the las cannons will be trying to take them out as a top priority before they get wiped from the board. Finally, in the gun line, we have a slightly more experimental formation, with a Tech Priest Engine Seer escorting 3 units of 4 servitors with 2 plasma cannons each. Plasma cannons are pretty efficient in the guard at the moment, particularly when they can be used on cheap models that you don't really care about dying that much. So for 150 points for a fire base of 6 plasma cannons hitting on 4s, and of course a bunch of slightly more durable bodies, I think that's 150 points fairly well spent if we're restricting ourselves to infantry. You could absolutely swap these guys out for a trio of missile launcher armed heavy weapons teams, for example. They'll both do a fairly similar job in terms of putting out a decent amount of anti-tank firepower, but they're both very fragile and would be expected to be picked up fairly soon, as they're some of the best places that the opponent can focus their guns. To round out the HQ section, they also have a Primaris Psyker, which I didn't mention earlier. He'd be primarily in the middle of the army, throwing out a Smiter turn, and if one of the Astropaths gets killed, he can also replace them and take over duties for either Night Shroud or Psychic Maelstrom if needed. To round it all off, we also have our Warlord, who is one of the company commanders, who'll be having Cure of Sequilla to get us some command points back, and Old Grudges to give full rerolls to wound against the biggest, most pressing threat in the enemy army. If it's a tank, he'll likely deploy himself with the command squads and veteran squads at the back, and if it's an infantry unit on the front line, he will likely move up alongside the massive infantry wave. Overall, I think the list will be a blast to play, though obviously with so many models will be a fair amount of hard work and you'd have to speed play quite quickly. I have run similar lists at events in the past though, and it's been okay. Overall, I think the list does give really good board control, particularly in the early game before you lose too many infantry squads, but despite all of our best efforts, it doesn't have the greatest damage output. I feel that guard infantry in general aren't quite as strong on the damage output at front compared with our tanks and some of the other options in different codexes out there. I think that this would struggle the most against armies capable of outranging it for a turn or two and then moving forward to wipe out the remnants after they've shot their entire army into the list a couple of times. The game plan would usually have to be working on securing objectives and keeping as much of the army alive and intact as possible, taking out enemy key threats, particularly anything that's very efficient against infantry, and the last few turns would likely be using our remaining assets to try and fight and contest the last few objectives. In terms of stratagem use throughout the game, I'd certainly be looking to make use of combined squads, particularly to make orders and combat more efficient, and also the psychic buffs from the Astropaths. And it could be particularly handy against Chaos if you get 4 rerolls with a big squad to hit and to wound in the shooting phase. If I had to think about other variants for different armies, I'd be very tempted to try a Cadian version of the list. For me, with a Cadian version, we'd be looking a lot more gun lining, particularly with the recent points drops to missile launchers and las cannons. I think that I'd be deploying a lot of my standard infantry squad troops with these weapons, and making liberal use of the Cadian take aim order and overlapping fields of fire to make everyone more accurate. It will most certainly play very differently to this one, with far higher damage output at range, but not quite as much beefy melee strength to overpower enemy troops in the midfield, so better in some matchups and worse against others. Let me know your thoughts and opinions on the list, and if there's anything that you'd improve on it. I'm well aware that Infantry Guard isn't the top dog for Imperial Guard lists right now. I think that a more hybrid approach tends to work best, with infantry squads screening very heavy firepower in tanks and artillery. But if there are any optimizations that you think that you'd make, let me know down in the comments. If you've enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. We have regular Imperial Guard content coming out every 2 days. And if you'd like to support the channel and keep the videos coming, I do have a Patreon page, which is how I can dedicate more time to the channel. So any support will be greatly appreciated if you are enjoying all the Guard content. There are also some other videos for Patreon supporters, such as prize draws, early videos, and my own exclusive tournament lists and reports. So if any of that interests you, then the link is down in the description. Thanks very much for listening, and keep on holding the line.